It seems particularly appropriate for me to be speaking about translation in this first sermon after my parental leave, as the last few months of my life have been an exercise in translation. Indeed, life with a tiny human who, as my 3-year-old friend says, has no words, requires a constant ability to translate. The baby says, "Wah!" You know that cry? Several times a day. And each time we go through the list of what that cry could mean. Is she hungry, tired, bored, wet diaper? Is she just cranky because it's 6 p.m. and that's crank o'clock? Like that rabbit in our story discovered about the word God, there are many things that a baby's cry could mean. As with any exercise in translation, I think that we've gotten a little bit better as the weeks have gone by, but we're still not always right, and there's always that great satisfaction in figuring it out when you get the translation just right. But as you may have guessed, I'm not actually here to talk about translating a baby's cries. That would be a very different sermon. I want to talk about translation when it comes to the language of religion, which to some of you I know may well be just as annoying as a screaming baby. That's okay. When I say the language of religion, I mean words like God, faith, salvation, sin, sacrament, prayer, spirit, sacred, blessing, grace. I could go on. These are words that have been used by people of faith for centuries now to talk about what they believe and how they practice their faith. There are plenty of Unitarian Universalists who love this language, me included. But as a movement, we have had something of an allergic reaction to the language of faith for the last several decades. I believe that we are moving past that allergy, and I still see it crop up more often than I would like, both in our larger movement and here in this congregation. There are times when people just shut down and stop listening when these words are used, or even worse, make fun of these words or the people who use them. I still hear stories from my colleagues about people in their congregations who count the number of times they say the word God in their sermons and report back each week, rather than listening to what the rest of the sermon might have been trying to say. I know there are people in my home congregation in Minnesota who would cringe if I called their fellowship a church. And I know that there are people in this room who would really struggle if I said we were going to start including prayer in our services. That's not an announcement, don't worry. The extent of this allergy showed itself back in 2002 when Unitarian Universalist Association President Bill Sinkford preached about a language of reverence and the need for UUs to get more comfortable using religious language. The sermon got picked up by some news outlets and unfortunately twisted a little bit, as often happens with the news. And as Sinkford wrote years later, generated more mail, email, and phone calls to the UUA than perhaps anything else in our history. Many Unitarian Universalists were shocked, some were fearful, a few were grateful. I have to believe that only in Unitarian Universalism would a sermon on religious language be a catalyst for such controversy. The question of the language we use to talk about our faith is still an open one today, 16 years later. We are constantly grappling with these two realities: the real power of religious language, the power it carries, and the real theological diversity that exists in our movement and within our individual congregations. That theological diversity that we so love and value about our faith. My feelings about religious language have evolved greatly over the years. I believe I've spoken in the past about my childhood congregation, a UU fellowship in Minnesota in which words like God or faith or even church were anathema. I was raised to believe that those words had nothing to do with Unitarian Universalism. There was a point at which I wasn't even willing to say that Unitarian Universalism was a religion. It was actually during my 6 years of Catholic school theology classes that this all started to break down. You see, those classes were the first time that anyone had asked me to think about what I believed, what I had faith in. It was the first time that I was challenged to define my faith by something other than what it was not. And so I went from the 7th grader who wrote in answer to the question about my personal relationship with God, this is a real quote from 7th grade me, "I do not have a personal relationship with God because I do not believe in God." The Catholics love that. To the 12th grader, so that was me in 7th grade, I became the 12th grader who wrote papers about personal religious experience, in part to try to figure out why it was that I had started to find Catholic Mass so meaningful, a situation that baffled me at the time. For me, it has been my encounters with people of other religious traditions that have convinced me of the power and importance of traditional religious language, and have taught me how to translate that language into something that is meaningful to me. As I began to talk about religion with people who were not Unitarian Universalists, I found that they were able to speak so much more clearly about what their faith meant to them than I could. It is surprising, given how much we love words as Unitarian Universalists, that we struggle when it comes to finding the words to talk about Unitarian Universalism and what it really means to us. The Reverend Jean Newyar writes in her book, Fluent on Faith, "For a people whose religious lives are embedded in conversation, too often we grope and grasp for words when we try to talk about our deepest spiritual longings and aspirations. Perhaps that is why we talk so much," she says, "because we do not talk clearly. We keep on talking because what we say is never quite satisfying." This is precisely what I have discovered as I've spoken with Christians and Jews and Muslims and even people with no faith at all. They are able to speak clearly and deeply about what their faith means to them. And I, even though it's my job to talk about Unitarian Universalism, I flounder sometimes, struggling to find the right words. Or sometimes I manage to say something that feels deep and true, and I do so knowing that if I were to say those same words from this pulpit, they may not be received well. I agree with Reverend Jean Newyar that we do a disservice to ourselves and even more so to our children by avoiding religious language. As she writes, "These are the words that, when used in a wholesome way, can deepen our inner lives, our holy relationships with others, and our embrace of the larger spirit of life. Making such words available to young children as their worldviews are being shaped offers them a great gift of faith. To begin to use them as our children are learning language and growing their vocabularies will make it easier for them to embrace the healthy, liberal meanings that these words have in our hearts, rather than the meanings so often implied in our public discourse. For me, using religious language as Unitarian Universalists is an act of reclaiming. It is saying that these are our words too. The word God does not have to imply an all-powerful, all-knowing, sentient being who lives in the sky. As our story about the rabbit showed us, it can have all different kinds of meanings for all different kinds of people or creatures or even trees. Perhaps what God really means is what is most important to each one of us. For me, I've gotten into the habit of translating God as love in my head. For me, God is the love that is within and among us and beyond us. God is the love that has shown up in the most difficult moments of my life, and the love that permeates the most joyful moments. God is the love that I feel when I'm here with all of you, and the love that motivates me to work for justice in the world. What is it that's most important to you? What motivates you? What sustains you when life gets tough? Maybe that's how you can translate God for you, just as the butterfly said it was the guiding wind and the fish said that it was the water. We've gotten into the habit, the unfortunate habit, I think, of treating these words as one-dimensional, and they are so much more than that. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't limits to what we can translate. There are moments when that translation just doesn't work, and the way religious language is being used runs counter to our convictions. For me, this happened when Tristan and I were engaged, and I felt really strongly that we should do some sort of premarital counseling. We were being married by friends, so we weren't sure exactly where to look. They couldn't do it. And so being a millennial, I turned to the internet and found what appeared to be a secular, self-directed, online premarital preparation course. Can you guess where this is going? So we bought it and we watched the first video together, and about 2 minutes in, it became clear that it was not what we had expected. This video featured a woman making brownies for the Bible study group that was coming over. And in walks the man a little bit later than she wanted him to come, her partner, coming home from golfing. The video went on to talk about how relationships really have 3 players in them. And this part actually wasn't as bad as the golfing and the brownies for me. But relationships really have 3 players: the man, the woman, and Christ. We stopped watching. And somehow it had eluded us when we looked at the course that it was a conservative Christian curriculum. Which, if it had just been a Christian curriculum, I think we could have handled it. But we came to the conclusion very quickly that this was not going to be something that we could translate. It was not because of the language that was used, but because of the worldview it espoused. It was just about as heteronormative as you can get, and was just steeped in patriarchy. So we stopped watching. In that case, no matter how much translating we might have done, the curriculum would have presented a vision of the world that ran counter to ours. it wasn't about the words they were using. It was about the theology that they were using those words to describe. The same can be said for the times when translation is important and useful. It's not about the words, it's about the theology. As I have been a part of the Immigrant Solidarity Vigils in Manchester over the past year, I've had to exercise my translation muscles nearly every time. God, salvation, sin, grace, these words flow throughout the prayer vigils, likely meaning slightly different things to every person in attendance. But in this case, the words point to a world where welcoming the stranger is a sacred act. Bringing God's justice to the world means not separating families. And salvation comes when we are all free from the bonds of injustice. The words may not always be the first ones I would choose to use, but being able to find meaning in those words in that setting allows me to build power with other justice-seeking people of faith so that we might begin to build the world we dream about. If I left those vigils just because I was hung up on the words, I'd be missing out on the opportunity to create meaningful change with others. Religious language can be useful and powerful when we use it to point to that which we care deeply about. It can be a powerful tool by giving us the language to talk about our deepest spiritual longings and aspirations. It can be a powerful tool that allows us to be in relationship with other people of faith. It can be a powerful tool to name the moral injustices that exist in our world. In a theologically diverse tradition like Unitarian Universalism, we may not always mean the same thing when we use words like God, but we are pointing in the same direction. Reverend Newyar writes, "Even as I urge us to use religious language more broadly, I caution that we must hold these words lightly, using them to point and to suggest, not to define. These words will serve us best if we allow them to be elastic, perhaps not meaning precisely to me what they mean to you or to your Jewish neighbor or your Lutheran in-laws, but pointing in the same direction, capturing the essence of the shared experience, a shared longing for a deeper spiritual life." So if you're sitting here and you struggle with finding meaning in traditional religious language, I challenge you to pick just one word and consider how it might be meaningful for you. How might it allow you to deepen your understanding of who you are as a Unitarian Universalist? If you already love traditional religious language, I challenge you not to shy away from using it in this space, even if you're not sure what others believe. Reverend Newyar writes at the end of her book, "Our faith carries tidings of comfort and joy, tidings of hope and freedom. Let us grow in our fluency in communicating these tidings, that we may grow in our faith and that the world may be more generously blessed with the good works that flow when faith is strong and sure. Our faith," she writes, "affirms an open-minded, open-hearted attitude towards all. Let our own faith be clear and strong enough so that we can be truly open, so that we can be relaxed and easy and receptive, conveying comfort from our own deep center of assurance, our own deep center of faith." May it be so for all of us.